Kieran Nolan. I'm from the School of Chemical Sciences at Nolan City University, and I'm just going to present to you an overview of some research that we've carried out over the last 6-7 years on the development of new materials for wastewater treatment. Specifically, our interest is actually in industrial wastewater treatment, but I'll give you a general overview of the actual area and field. Now, basically, our concern in terms of our targets is basically the removal of pharmaceuticals, pesticides, specifically pharmaceuticals in terms of the industry here in Ireland. And of course, pharmaceuticals are becoming a problem in the environment. I mean, it's been noticed since the 60s, but certain pharmaceuticals are building up and they have been problematic. In particular, take for example, diclofenac, the anti-inflammatory. Its impact on bird populations is immense. And almost came to a problem I know in India where there was a massive wipeout of vultures. So we're looking at a major problem in terms of actual contamination in the basically the general environment. And the problem with pharmaceuticals, of course, is they're bioactive molecules. Secondly, they're also designed to be quite resilient within the body, so they actually have a good bioavailability, and that makes them somewhat challenging and difficult to actually decompose in terms of wastewater treatment. Now, in terms of most routes of pharmaceuticals, probably groups. This actual cartoon has quite a few different aspects. Probably the biggest route of pharmaceuticals into the environment is actually through people, in terms of disposal, in terms of obviously urination, and human waste. Other sources, of course, is the industry itself in terms of manufacturing. And of course, that's all changing right now because of new regulations that have come into Europe in the last few years. There's also aspects of hospital waste. So there's quite a few different routes for it to come into the actual environment. Now, in terms of actual water treatment, we're looking at general stages of water treatment. Basically, the first stage is simply a cleaning or settling of solids. The next treatment basically is activated sludge, where biological organisms, whether it be aerobic or anaerobic, can actually act on materials and degrade them, mineralize them, etc. Now, many pharmaceuticals at this stage can be biodegraded, but quite a few aren't. As I mentioned before, they're fairly rugged molecules, and they're quite stable to an awful lot of biodegradation pathways. And as a result, they can pass out of this stage totally untreated and not removed, or only partially reduced in terms of actual removal. So there is a need to develop technologies that can actually remove these culprit compounds out of the environment, given the fact that they do have significant environmental impact. Now, tertiary treatment is the option. Secondary treatment is pretty well the standard, primary and secondary. Now, tertiary treatment is really a polishing step for water. This is basically where you're going to be removing small molecules out of the actual water. Now, in the past 30 years, there's an awful lot of different types of treatments that are being used and are used. Probably the most common, of course, is activated carbon. But there's also certain oxidation processes, and you're all familiar with chlorination, etc. And each process does work to a point, and each one has its problems. So basically, we're looking at polishing, and again, as I mentioned, physical treatment. We have membrane filtration, separation, reverse osmosis, and ion exchange, and activated carbon. Those are typically used. Now, activated carbon absorption has its own problems. Well, all of them have their own problems, but part of the problem with activated carbon absorption is that, think of this, as a tertiary treatment mechanism, what's happening is that organic molecules are accumulating onto the surface of the activated carbon. At some point, that activated carbon will actually be quenched, i.e. it can't absorb anymore. As a result, you're left with an organic waste problem. So you have two options. You can thermally treat and reactivate the activated carbon, or you can simply dispose of it as organic waste, both of which are quite costly. And in terms of thermal treatment, you're going to be losing quite a bit of mass with respect to the activated carbon. The same thing is also true with different types of filtration methods. You're using membranes, and these membranes are going to be capturing out the organic waste. And that also has to be disposed of. And of course, filtration systems do require energy. So you're looking at somewhat potentially energy intensive situations. and also potential organic waste situations. So you haven't really solved your actual problem. Now, in terms of chemical treatment, chlorination, ozonation, chlorination has been used, bleach, a good oxidant, but the problem is that it may not completely degrade the compounds down, and sometimes you're synthetically transforming them into new culprit molecules, which may be more cytotoxic than what you actually started with. So it can be quite problematic, and of course you also have the halomethane problems, which you want to use. Now, ultraviolet disinfection, there are molecules that can absorb light and decompose photochemically, but again, they're decomposing into smaller molecules, and one does not know their actual impact and or toxicities. Now, hydrogen peroxide disinfection is quite effective. It generates the good old hydroxy radical, which is a super powerful, well, the most powerful oxidant you're pretty well going to get in water. However, our interest is in photocatalysis, and one of the reasons why photocatalysis is because potentially it could use solar light. So this is the onset of it. The photocatalysis, and I'll show you in a second basically what we're talking about, photochemical definitions. We have photodegradation. I just mentioned that, where a molecule can absorb light and decompose. A photocatalyst is going to generate a reagent and be recycled. So let's look at possibilities. Probably the one that's winning right now in terms of photocatalyst is titanium dioxide. It's commonly manufactured, a common product in a lot of formulated products. And simply put, to make a piece of chemistry here, a very short overlook, what happens to TiO2? It absorbs UV light. It pumps an electron from its valence band to what we call the conduction band, and in essence what happens is an electron pops up here, it's picked up by oxygen to form a superoxide radical anion, which in itself is a weak oxidant. It can also form hydroxide radical later, but the key is this hole that's left. This is an oxidant, and it actually generates hydroxy radicals. I keep stressing hydroxy radicals because they are your most powerful in terms of redox potential oxidant that you want to have in water. And the great thing about this material, as you irradiate and it does this, it doesn't decompose. There are other oxidants, photochemical oxidants, and I specialize in my career with photosensitizers, that can generate reactive species, but unfortunately they decompose over time. So TiO2 is a wonderful aspect, but the only weakness of it, I suppose, is that it does only absorb UV light. And again, it's a very common material. And in terms of just describing a little bit about the chemistry, usually the anatase form of TiO2, there's different crystalline forms that TiO2 can have. The anatase and the rutile are the most commonly used in terms of photochemical applications. And typically we use what's referred to as P25, which is about 70% anatase to rutile. Now there are problems with TiO2, and that is TiO2 usually comes as nanoparticles. You want to optimize your surface area to optimize the amount of hydroxy radical you generate. So the removal themselves from a water body is actually a problem that you're actually treating. You can't have TiO2 obviously leaching into the environment, and of course the UV region also is used. Now just to mention, we have screened TiO2 here in Ireland in the summertime, and it does work with iris solar light, okay? But it's not as effective. Now we did a lot of research ourselves into trying to convert or synthesize TiO2 conjugates which function not only in the UV region but also in the visible region. And we found that actually they did work, but in some cases we were only getting partial oxidations of pharmaceutical products. Now just to go back to activated carbon, as I mentioned before, probably the most commonly used absorbent in terms of tertiary treatment. What we're looking at is a macroporous, microporous material, massive quantity of surface area, has wonderful hydroxy, carboxy acid, and also aromatic and alkyl functional groups on the surface. So it's quite capable of absorbing out many classes of molecules. However, again, I've already discussed the problem with it, is that it basically, once it gets to this state where all the pollutants are there, all sites are saturated, it has to be either disposed of or thermally treated to remove all the pollution and reactivate it. And again, that's actually mentioned on this slide in a bit more detail. So many years ago, not many years ago, but 15, 16 years ago, there was a potential solution where what would happen if you could integrate your TiO2 nanoparticles, which are problematic themselves, onto a macroparticle such as activated carbon. The logic here is this, is that you're going to be making a composite material. The activated carbon will absorb the pollution, and then one would irradiate with UV light, and the TiO2 will start generating hydroxy radicals that will destroy the molecules on the surface of the actual activated carbon. So it becomes a fairly potentially cheaper solution to clean your activated carbon, in essence. And the idea, again, is solar irradiation, if it can be done and accomplished. So we spent quite a bit of time developing these type of IPCAs. Most of it now is all in the literature that we've published. And basically what we've done through simple techniques, whether it be sonication and or thermal techniques, we can readily control the amount of titanium dioxide that we put onto the surface as represented by these red dots, okay? So again, the idea is you get absorption, and when you basically have used up or the activated carbon is now saturated, you then irradiate with light. Of course, there's always mass transfer occurring with your pollutant. It generates hydroxy radicals and destroys the pollution, cleaning your activated carbon, and that way it can then be reused again. So we've actually screened quite a few different compounds. There's some of them pharmaceuticals and also pesticides. And some of this work was in conjunction with actual pharmaceutical companies. And we found actually that it's fairly effective. It works on about 70 to 90% of pharmaceuticals. There are certain pharmas that it simply doesn't work well on. And as for the pesticides, it only works in terms of the ones I've shown, which are highly chlorinated pesticides. It only really works in an absorption capacity, and the photocatalysis did not succeed in terms of regeneration. So we then turned ourselves to the new carbonaceous material graphene, and the idea here is graphene is basically sheets of carbon, not too different than activated carbon in some cases, and has multiple functionalizations on the surface. And we were interested in basically immobilizing titanium dioxide onto this surface to see, A, if we could replicate what we did with activated carbon, because this material should be an absorbent. As I said before, it can actually mimic, or has similar properties to activated carbon. And also graphene photochemically is interesting because it absorbs in the visible region. And the question is, can we get electrons pumping from one side to the other to actually activate TiO2 in the visible region? So there's quite a lot of different synthesis, and again, this is in the literature. Here are just some photographs of what we made over the years. And one of the things we also did, we found was more effective, is that there's a thing called graphene paper. We weren't interested in this. We created through freeze drying actual graphene sponges. That way when they hit water, they disperse beautifully. We're looking at some performances of absorption of just graphene, and this is with just methylene blue, so we're getting pretty good absorption, so it is working well, absorptivity. We also have a pretty high surface area with graphene, okay, not as high as activated carbon, but a surface area that's quite sufficient for absorption applications. And we're looking at various pharma absorptions. Now in the work, we did discover one drug. One drug actually crystallized at subsaturation concentrations off the surface of graphene. And again, this is graphene oxide, I should basically stress, not reduced graphene, so it is oxy-functionalized. And right now we're exploring this. Again, here's an example. Subsaturated, put in your graphene sponge, and we get crystallization, which is quite interesting. We're working on it right now. We do have some explanations for it, but again, that's a different discussion. Now, in terms of the photocatalysis, what we did is different techniques where we put nanoparticles onto the surface, like we did with activated carbon, but we also synthesized nanoparticles and nanotubes onto the graphene surface itself, synthetically. And again, here's some nice photographs. These here are the actual nanotubes that we synthesize. This is just a standard photochemical reactor that we use. And again, more pictures in terms of the nanotubes. What we found, basically, with these particular results is that the nanotubes were the best. And the reason why they were the best is they actually worked in the visible region, not just the UV region. Now, we looked at various other forms of nanoparticles on the surface. They were somewhat effective, pretty well as effective as what we had with activated carbon. So there's nothing of great significance, I suppose, that graphene can offer you, except in the case of the actual titanium nanotubes. Those are working in the visible region. So just to sum up, given the fact that we're coming to the end, so basically speaking, in terms of the photocatalysis with graphene oxide composites, the actual preparation of them is fairly straightforward, but the problem is quantity of mass. That's another thing I would warn anybody proceeding with graphene, is you don't get much mass. It's not like activated carbon, which is higher. It is indeed reusable. We've demonstrated that. We can do it. It has higher UV efficiency and also visible light efficiency than the activated carbon composites did, because they can perform in the visible region. And they can be regenerated and high absorption. So just to wrap up the actual presentation in terms of the materials, I suppose graphene oxide has potential. What we're excited by is the crystallization phenomenon as chemists. However, it does have potential to function in the complete solar region, unlike the integrated photocatalytic absorbents with activated carbon and TiO2. So it is basically promising. So presently, right now, we are working in conjunction with an actual industrial partner here in Ireland, where we're applying TiO2 reactor, or TiO2 in new reactor configurations, in terms of removing excess waste out of their actual pharmaceutical waste streams. Just want to thank the following people, myself and also Ann Morrissey, who led the group in the last 7, John Tobin, Sheikh Basha, and also Michael Ogamore were involved many years ago in it. And these are the graduated PhD students who carried out most of the research, which I must say, just briefly overview for you. And again, other collaborators at DCU, Jenny Lawler and Bree Quilty. So if you have any questions, I'll take them later on. Thanks.